Recording has begun.
You're ready for me? Good evening. My name's Shirley McCormick, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of the Harrisburg area. And on behalf of the League, I want to welcome you all and thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening. Normally, if we were meeting, the weather would have probably kept many of you away. So that's the positive aspect of Zoom, that we can continue and have this informational meeting. If you're not familiar with the League of Women Voters, we do not support any political candidates nor any political party. Our purpose, for a little over 100 years, we were formed right after, at the time women got the vote in 1920. We have strived to register people to vote, then get them out to actually vote. And as part of that, we also want to educate people. It's been for 100 years our purpose to try and educate them, because voting is a privilege that you have, but you should be an educated voter. You should know about the various issues. You should know what the candidates have to say in order to make an intelligent vote when you do vote. So tonight is an example of trying to educate people about something that, although many of us have heard of it, we don't really understand what this Electoral College is. We know there have been presidential elections where one candidate got the most popular vote, but the other candidate ended up being president because of this Electoral College. So why do we have it, and what's its purpose, and why is it important, or is it important? And we are very privileged tonight to have people have been there. It's a wonderful place, interactive kind of things for you to see. And of all things, this is kind of a personal comment, but I think the League feels the same way. If you should know about anything, you should know about the Constitution of the United States, because it is the thing that has kept us a democracy for over 200 years. It's a very simple, short little document, and very few of us understand what it says and what it doesn't say, and what it allows people to do and what it doesn't allow people to do. So we're going to learn a portion of the Constitution this evening. So they took some of my fire away. I had a note to tell you that we'd be recording. It will be on YouTube, but my understanding is, and I'm not a techie person, it will be unlisted. So you need to go to our website, which is lwvhbg.org. And from there, under resources, you'll be able to go to this if you want to review it again later, or share it with somebody who was unable to join us this evening. So we are very fortunate to have with us two people from the Constitution Center. Dr. Kerry Sautner, she is the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. In her current role, she oversees all aspects of the public's on-site experience and leads the center's national education efforts. Before joining the staff at the National Constitution Center in 2005, Kerry worked in program development at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. She also served as an adjunct professor of education at Drexel University. Sautner obtained her doctorate in educational leadership and management from Drexel University with a focus on creativity and innovation within educational facilities. She is the vice chair of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, our state organization, on the board of directors for the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, and I screwed up the other one. She's vice chair of the League of Women Voters of the Philadelphia area, and she's actively involved with several other civic and historical organizations. Joining her is Thomas Donnelly, who is a senior fellow for constitutional studies at the National Constitution Center. His specialties include constitutional theory, American political development, and American constitutional history. Prior to joining the National Constitution Center in 2016, Donnelly served as counsel at the Constitutional Accountability Center as a, and I will pronounce this incorrectly, Klimenko Fellow and Lecturer on Law at Harvard Law School, and as a law clerk to the Honorable Thomas Ambro on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Donnelly is a graduate of Yale Law School, where he was a projects editor for the Yale Law Journal and a Coker Fellow. So thank them both for being here, and thank you all for joining us. And I turn it over to you, Kerry.
Thank you. I'm going to do some switching around. What an exciting evening. And I thank you all for being here. It's great to have you here. It's exciting to see my worlds collide. So now I have the Constitution Center and voter services for the state all together. So thank you for having us. I'm also excited that I got to bring in Tom Donnelly, who is one of my favorite scholars at the center, who's going to really walk us through this great history. And Shirley, you did such a fantastic job. They are all the questions that I always ask Tom when we're teaching this class. I want to know everything about the Electoral College, but it really starts with, what were they thinking, Tom? You know, I always start there is, what were those guys thinking when they said, hey, let's make this system because it's really hard and super confusing, but there's a reason behind it. So what Tom's going to do tonight is he's going to walk us through the American history. We're going to ask questions as we go through, and we're going to try to understand kind of what was the genesis in the founding generation to build the Electoral College. How has it been tested and changed over time with different amendments? And then what are the questions around it today? So that will really bring us all the way up to the conversations around things like the national popular vote and ranked choice voting, which I know are things top to the league in the state, but across the nation as well. So Tom, you want to say any kind of get your Wheaties ready, get your coffee ready if you haven't had it, any kind of intro before we get started?
I don't think so. Let's just dig right in, Kerry.
Okay, I think I just want to check, Tom, a little hard to hear you. Is everybody else, can everybody else hear Tom okay, or is it just me?
He sounded a little far away.
Okay.
Okay, let me see, let me just shift. I'll be right back, Kerry. Let me just shift.
No worries. Okay, I'll get them started and then we'll wait for you. So as we go through this, what I just did really quickly is we have a PowerPoint presentation to go along with this. So I shared that. So hopefully everybody can right now see learning about the Electoral College. Oh, thank you, Emily. I was going to say, if you can see it, give me thumbs up. We love those kind of things as we go through. Human interaction is the sad part about Zoom. We're going to walk you through kind of that history with those visuals, all the tools that we have put around this. We have the interactive constitution, and I'll put that link in the chat in a minute. We have all of the materials we wrote to teach this class, the PowerPoint and videos on this. Emily and team from their league are going to send out an e-blast with all of those links. So don't worry about the links that I put in there. Check them out if you want to. But if you're not sure about it, you can get them later in a follow-up email. So we're here to give you all that you need so you can listen, ask questions, and have fun with this. So Tom, how do you sound now?
All right. Do I sound better now?
You sound awesome. Great.
Okay. I had some technical difficulties earlier, so I'm using a different device. But now hopefully we're okay.
Sounds great. Okay, Electoral College. Tom, I know you always like to start with the document. So do you want to start with the Constitution and dive right in there?
Yeah, no, that would be perfect. Let's start with the Constitution's text. It's a long text, so there are two places you're going to look for it. Article 2, Section 1, and then the 12th Amendment. Those are the two key parts. But I mean, I think everyone sort of understands the mechanics, but let's just make sure we're all on the same page. You know, the Electoral College today, it's comprised of 538 votes. That's determined by each state's congressional representation. Plus, with the 23rd Amendment, the District of Columbia gets 3 electoral votes. So the electoral vote for each state is determined by the number of members of the House of Representatives you have and the members of the U.S. Senate. So you just see that across various areas. But of course, as we've already noted, because of the Electoral College, you can often have, or you can sometimes have, a winner of the national popular vote that doesn't actually win in the Electoral College. And that's because when people go to vote on election day, what they're voting for is a slate of electors. And the way this works in various states is that what you're determining is which party is going to win in that state. And that state then appoints the electors in that state. And then those electors actually do get together on a particular day set by Congress to vote. And that's what's going to decide the outcome of the election. If someone gets a majority in the Electoral College, they become president. Even if they didn't get a majority of the national popular vote. The other thing to note is that if someone does not get a majority in the Electoral College, the election then goes to the House of Representatives, with the representatives voting by state, which has happened a few different times in American history, and we'll talk about that. I mean, that's sort of the nuts and bolts. The other thing, though, to note, and we'll emphasize this a lot as we talk about the history of the Electoral College, is that the other thing built into this system, it's a system of federalism. So the Constitution is leaving in place. It's leaving for each state. It gives them the discretion to determine the mode of appointment of their electors. That's what Article 2, Section 1 says. And with this, we see over time states experimenting with many different reforms, coalescing around mostly basically mechanisms that translate the popular vote into the electors' votes in each respective state. But we do see variation, including, as you already said, Kerry, Maine moving toward ranked choice voting. And so it's within the system. It's allowing for experimentation between the states of how they're going to set their electors. But that's a bit about the mechanics. I don't know if there's anything else you want to put on the table, Kerry.
Yeah, before we dive into the kind of the history of where did this idea come from and why did the founding fathers put it into the Constitution, I want to just kind of like parse out looking at the country, because I mean, I have to say, and I'm always looking for positives. That's just, if you don't know me, that's just something about me. I'm always looking for the positive. I feel like many people in America now understand this tricky system a little bit more now. They understand that you're voting, this is you voting on election day, but you're actually voting for a slate of electors. And then those slate of electors are picking the candidate. I mean, we saw that in tough ways in the last month, but we really kind of understand the process. But Tom, before we go into the history of it, when we look at this big map, and we see kind of the numbers that pop up in this map, and you broke it down for us where these numbers come from. All states aren't the same. There are two kind of outliers, like 55 in California. We'll look at California. It's a winner take all state. So can you just break down for us really quickly what's the difference between a winner take all state and like something like Nebraska, which is a split electoral vote, just so we see kind of the ways the Electoral College has been modified by that system of federalism and power that the states do have over election laws.
Yeah, of course. So the two main, 48 states have winner take all systems. And that means that whoever wins the popular vote in that state, and it could be by a single vote, you get all of the electoral votes in that particular state. So that's how California works, Pennsylvania, et cetera. But again, those rules are set by the state legislatures in each state, so they can change them. State legislatures between now and the next election day could choose to move away from a winner-take-all system or select different ways. You could just have the state legislature select the electors without holding a popular vote. That's been the case in some states throughout American history. So there's great variation. There's a possibility of variation. But the winner-take-all is if you win by one vote statewide, you get all the electoral votes. In Nebraska, in Maine, the way it works is that the electors are distributed. They basically, each congressional district provides one. If you win each congressional district, you get an electoral vote for winning that congressional district. And then if you win the statewide vote, you get the extra two that would be for the United States senators. And so it allows for more proportional voting within each state. So that's Nebraska and Maine do that. And I think you saw in both states, in both Nebraska and Maine, a split where where Joe Biden picked up one in Nebraska and Donald Trump picked up one in Maine. And so you do see that sometimes.
And it was the first time I really noticed the candy stripe on the map, that when the election night was coming in, you see the red states, you see the blue states, you see like kind of the coloring, maybe they're going to go this way. And then I started to notice this year was the first time like they had a striped map for those states. So again, the reason why I bring this up is because so many of us are in Pennsylvania and we're working around kind of the league work that looks at voter registration and voter engagement and counting the votes. And so there's kind of this in-between option, but so many times we've also talked about the differences between county to county voting and the differences between state and state over across the country. So all these pieces, just to reiterate, is around that idea of federalism, that the national government spells out kind of big picture how it works, but it's left up to the states to determine the finality of it and how it's going to happen. And we'll get into that and why it was broken up that way when we get into the convention story and kind of putting those pieces together. Now, Tom, I know we normally do this when we do this class, but I thought it would be fun to do it with everybody today, and we could do a vote in the chat. So do you want to lay out the hypothetical for everybody? And they probably know the answer, but we'll still play the game.
So sure, the hypothetical here is, suppose that a state passes a law using its powers under Article 2, Section 1 to set the mode of appointing their electors, saying that they will hear, the questions here is, can a state punish an electoral college elector when she casts her vote for a presidential candidate that differs from the one that actually won the popular vote in the state in the most recent election? So the idea here is you're requiring electors in advance to pledge their support for the popular vote winner. An elector decides they want to exercise their own independent judgment and not vote for the person they pledged for. Can a state punish them?
So I'll pause for a minute and you guys can answer in the chat. Yes, no, maybe, it all depends. We take many forms of answers when we do this because sometimes it all depends. But the reason why we tee up this question is because we can look at the Constitution and say kind of, how has the Constitution changed and what was the intent of the writers of that section of the Constitution and when they went through. So I love the answers. I really appreciate you guys. There's a lot of no's. Appreciate Margaret with, I have no idea. Good answer, Margaret, you're allowed. Probably not, and it depends, and I don't know. Yes, but it differs state to state. Interesting answer, and Ray is maybe. Okay, we love those. We share no, but I know. The no, but is great, Susan, because there are a lot more questions after this election around how people are voting and what's their job at different points in time of the process. So let's go back in time to 1787, maybe even a little before 1787. We're in Philadelphia. It's a sweaty summer in Philadelphia. When is it not a sweaty summer in Philadelphia? And Tom, give us a little kind of understanding of when they come to the convention in Philadelphia in late May 25th is when they finally get a quorum together. What are they thinking about the presidency and the election and how this is going to work? Just lay out that groundwork and then we'll dive into when they got to the Electoral College.
Sure. So, it's always the natural question, I think, today to say, why in the world do we have this system? It's so complicated. We decide so many other elected officials just by popular vote. How did we end up with this really, really weird system that basically no one else in the world follows? And really, to understand how we got the Electoral College, you have to understand a bit about what the founding generation was thinking about when it was structuring the presidency itself. And this was a really, 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 really hard question for the founding generation. What was the executive of this new Constitution going to look like? And part of the reason it was so hard was that there was really not a great historical example out there of what they were really looking to create. Because they would look to Europe and they would see powerful kings. They looked to their own state governments. Remember, after the revolution, we wrote our own state constitutions, set up our own state governments. And what did we do with those state governments? We created really, really, really weak governors and very, very, very strong legislatures. And so the framers looked at that and they thought, well, gee, those governors aren't strong enough to govern a truly great nation. We want a president that's stronger than the governors. So they're looking for something in between a powerful king and very weak governors. But of course, also what we know about the founding generation is they were really, really concerned about executive power. They just fought a revolution to cast off a king. They were abused by royal officials. They didn't just fight that revolution in order to put another king or something like a king in place over them. They didn't like this distant British government. But if you lived in, almost any state, you're going to live so far away. You don't travel very much. You live so far away from your capital, Washington, D.C., or Philadelphia, or New York, might as well be Great Britain. And so they were really trying to figure out, they're trying to thread this needle between a president that's too weak or too strong. And so with this, they really kept coming back to four interrelated issues, as Kerry said there. And they're all, what they found over time is that as they settled one issue, they then changed their mind about how to settle the others. And so these key issues, we're going to talk about how to elect a president. That's our topic for today. But related to that were these other questions, which is how long should the president's term be? So if they're looking at the states at the time, most governors are serving for a year. We wanted rotation in office. We were really concerned about abuses of power. At the convention, they go between 4 years and 5 years, 6, 7-year terms for presidencies. Alexander Hamilton wanted a president for life. And so we see the range of debates there. But furthermore, they questioned, should the president be able to run for re-election? Again, in the states, we would often have term limits. Question is, do we want the president to be able to run for re-election? Sometimes the convention said yes. Sometimes the convention said no. And then finally, there's this question of how are we going to remove an abusive president? So the question of impeachment and removal. And so again, each of these things are interconnected. If you decide one thing, if you decide a president is going to serve, if a president could run for re-election, maybe you don't want Congress selecting the president, et cetera. And so we'll walk through some of those calculations. But the important thing to place on the table is, two things. One, they really, really were confused with what to do with the presidency. They didn't know what to do. They didn't see anything in the world that was exactly like what they wanted. And the other being that there are these four big issues that they wrestled with back and forth. And the how to elect a president was just one of those four. An important one, but just one of them.
So, and I'm only saying this because one of our scholars called last night, Akil Amar. Tom knows him well. I'm pretty sure he was your teacher at some point in time.
He was.
How much does George Washington play into the role of them thinking and kind of like understanding the presidency? Because pretty much that's what Akil said last night. It's all about Washington. That's why we get a strong president. He doesn't say much, but he has a huge influence. So I know normally we're so rushed for time when we do this talk that we have a little bit more time. So I just wanted to think about what they were thinking in their head when they thought about a president. Were they really thinking like, oh, Washington, he's what our perfect president would be?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And that's interesting, I think, in two ways. So one is, remember, they assume that they know Washington's going to be the first president, but they also know that no one after Washington is going to be Washington. And so because of that, they do have to set certain things in the Constitution and make certain decisions, knowing that George Washington was not always going to be by their side. And so they knew that that was going to be the case. The other, though, was, and just look at the text of the Constitution, compare Article 1 laying out Congress to Article 2 of the presidency. Article 1's really, really, really long because they think Congress is going to be the most powerful branch and they want to lay out as many things as possible to both say what they want Congress to do, but also to limit that power. Whereas with the presidency, I think the assumption was we're going to get a few of the big things right in there. One of them will be presidential election, because we do have to figure out what to do when George Washington isn't around anymore. But the other thing is we may have some things that are more open-ended in Article 2, knowing that George Washington will be the first president. He will then set the precedents. They won't be in the Constitution themselves, but through his own practice, his own actions, he's going to set what it's like to be the president, what powers the president's going to assume, what powers the president's not going to take on. And then other people, because of their reverence for Washington, are going to say, well, George Washington did it. Who am I to contradict George Washington? And we see this, just a classic example, Kerry, is look at people not running for more than 2 terms. He set that 2-term precedent in the first presidency, and it's not until FDR and the emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II that anyone had the audacity to take on that 3rd term and then that 4th term. And so they knew that they would both have some textual things in place there, but also knowing that George Washington, in his great judgment and because of people's reverence for him, would set really important precedents.
And that's always the fun part of this class, saying the precedents of the president in one sentence.
Exactly.
Just in case you need to work that in, have some fun with it. Okay, so we get to where did they come up with the idea from the Virginia plan? And I love this question one of our students in our classes asked before, and I'm just going to share it. One of the kids asked this great question. Did they take the idea from somebody else? And have we seen anybody else use it after? And Tom, no, right? This is like a lone star shining in the sun of the way presidents are elected. Was there any kind of genesis of where the idea came from? I know it comes out in the Virginia plan, but before that, were they looking to the ancient Greeks or Romans, some idea that they pulled from?
Well, yeah, so there are three possible places, none of them super strong precedents. One is the electors of the Holy Roman Emperor, but the two that would have been close to them, so I don't know if that was really on the table. I've heard scholars say that before. I'm not sure that that's true. But the two closest to them were the Scottish Parliament selected their members, certain of their members, by a similar elector system. And James Wilson, the forgotten founder, the delegate from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia, who was the key architect of the presidency, was from Scotland. And so there's some thought that maybe there might have been some connection. James Wilson helped forge the compromise over the Electoral College. So maybe it came there. There's Mr. Wilson, one of my absolute favorites. The other is that Maryland selected its state senate at the time with something like a system of electors. And what's interesting there is both of those systems required the electors to take an oath saying they're going to exercise their own independent judgment and would not be influenced unduly by anyone on the outside. And so those are two things, but they're really small precedents. And more than anything, I think, is, as we always emphasize and we'll emphasize tonight, the Electoral College just ends up being a compromise that everyone can live with. I think that's the best way you can summarize it. It's a compromise that a range of different delegates could live with.
Awesome. So they're at the convention. It's in the middle of the summer of 1787. As we always like to remind people, it's hot, it's sweaty. Philadelphia is not known for its good smells, or I mean, other than the food, or it's warm, easy summers, especially in 1787. These guys are wearing wool. It's not easy. They're in a room, Independence Hall that we call it now, was the Pennsylvania State House at the time. It was a secret meeting. So they kept things in secret so they could have open dialogues. That means all the windows were closed. And fun little story, they didn't want to disturb the delegates with all the commerce going on outside. So they laid down manure and straw all around to quiet the carriages from clacking on the Belgium block that's all around.
That's the right deliberative environment, right, Kerry? That sounds perfect.
Maybe this is why it only lasted one summer, and they were like, "We're done. The Electoral College sounds great." So they bring it into the storyline with the Virginia plan, and we've got these arguments on both sides, and then we have the coming together. So can you kind of bring us kind of the ideas that they bring into it, how they marry it together as a compromise, and then we'll move on to kind of the first test of the Electoral College.
That's perfect. So if we're thinking about, the delegates in the end lay out a few different options. And I'd say the key ones out there were, one, what you're seeing here, which is the congressional vote, that you're going to select the president by Congress. And so this is something that the delegates by broad majorities approved multiple times during the convention. It had very strong support in the convention. And you could understand the reason why. The idea here is that Congress is going to, under the Madisonian theory of the Constitution, attract the best and the brightest. All of the major national figures, many of them are going to end up in Congress. And these are people who are in a position to know who those candidates are who are running for president, people that would be in a position to be able to judge not only their policies, but their character. And so you think with Congress, you might have the most knowledgeable members of the nation selecting the president. The argument against it is what you see there, which is an argument advanced by Pennsylvania's Gouverneur Morris, that the danger is that you're going to then have a president, if the Congress is selecting the president, a president that owes too much to Congress. Remember, the founders are really concerned about a powerful Congress, thinking Congress is going to abuse the powers of the national government. And so the danger here is if Congress is selecting the president owes his position to Congress. And therefore, we're not going to have the sort of checks and balances between the president and Congress that we think are essential to protecting our liberties. And so I love the quote here from Gouverneur Morris, which is that, if you do this, if you have Congress select the president, the presidential selection is going to be the work of intrigue, of cabal, of faction. He also compared it to the cardinals and the conclave selecting the Pope. And so with that, that's sort of the arguments in favor, arguments against the congressional vote. The other, major proposal out there was the popular vote. There were delegates who supported the popular vote. The most prominent one was James Wilson, but Gouverneur Morris would support it. James Madison would even support the popular vote at various times. And why the popular vote? Well, James Wilson's arguments sound a lot like the ones we would make today, which is that the popular vote roots the presidency in popular sovereignty. That commandment in the preamble that we the people rule here in the United States. And so therefore the person who wins the popular vote is going to be in a position to then seize the mantle of having the selection of the American people. So what are the arguments against the popular vote? Because this was never approved by the delegates of the convention. Congressional vote was, popular vote never was. So what were the arguments against? Well, one of them was just mere elitism. So some, Alexander Hamilton certainly would have thought, the average voter selecting the president, that's ridiculous. How could that possibly work? We'll end up with horrible presidents. But really, for so many of the delegates, it was more of a practical issue. It wasn't a question of competence as much as it was a question of knowledge. Because the thing to remember is what we were doing with America was creating the largest republic in the history of the world. And so when you have when in that situation, it's very, information at the founding spreads very slowly, begins in the cities. But if you're out on the frontier, you may not even have newspapers. You may not really, the information of who these people are running for president, you may have absolutely no clue. You may be really smart. You may know what your interests are. You may have policy preferences, but you will know nothing about these candidates. And so this goes back to George Washington, Kerry. The framers thought, with these first couple of elections, everyone knows George Washington. Everyone loves George Washington. George Washington's going to be president. But after George Washington, there may be no other George Washingtons. And so because of that, we need some other body that can help us select and make good choices, channel maybe the people's preferences, but be able to judge one candidate from another. And so those are the competing. There are other proposals too, but those are the two big competing proposals.
So I always like to just remind people popular sovereignty was on the table. Like that was a discussion, and we come back to it again. And then, like you said, we have James Wilson always being the great contributor to bringing people back together, and says, okay, what if we do both? What if we break it down and do some kind of mixture between the two? And that's how we get kind of this multi-step process for the election of the president. You want to roll into how it was instantly put into play and instantly, it's almost like testing the wires. It always reminds me of Jurassic Park when they're testing the wires and like something's going to blow up. Then we lead us to my favorite story in American history, the election of 1796 and then concurrent elections. So tell us this fun story. It's like a soap opera.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, two quick things to frame the story. I mean, if you're looking, so the Electoral College, just to put a cap on the convention, it was the compromise. It was something that worked for the James Wilsons of the world who wanted the popular vote, the people who supported congressional election. For James Wilson, the thought was it's the closest he's going to get to the popular vote. And that if you use federalism to get more and more state legislatures to get people to have a say in the electors, that's going to spread like wildfire. And Wilson was right. It did spread like wildfire. We'll get to that later. But so that's what the Wilsons of the world, the popular vote people got. But people who supported the congressional vote thought that no one is going to command an electoral college majority. And so the electoral college effectively is just going to end up in Congress anyway. The House is going to select the president 19 times out of 20 is what George Mason said. And so, again, that can seem like a ridiculous prediction to us today. But again, this is a period without political parties, without a way of sorting the candidates. And so you can understand why they may have thought that. But so we end up with this electoral college, Kerry. And, again, with George Washington, it goes smoothly. 1788, first election. The second election, it's great. George Washington's running. Everyone in the Electoral College votes for him. He gets unanimous support. Furthermore, John Adams gets very strong support as the vice president. So the person with the most electoral votes becomes president under the original system. The person with the second most votes becomes vice president. And so it goes swimmingly in these first two elections. Then the next two, Kerry, not quite as well. So election of 1796, it's John Adams against Thomas Jefferson. And so here we already in 1796 see the emergence of early political parties. Adams affiliated with the early Federalists, Thomas Jefferson with the early Democratic Republicans. John Adams wins the electoral vote. He wins the presidency. The vote there is, what was it? I think it was 71 to 69. So it's really, really, really close. But this raises a problem. So remember, the second place person becomes the vice president. The hope was that the Federalists would coalesce around a second person who could then become the vice president. But the Federalist vote for vice president splits. And so vice president, the second highest vote getter is Thomas Jefferson, who becomes John Adams's vice president. This is like, imagine Hillary Clinton being Donald Trump's vice president or Donald Trump being Joe Biden's vice president. You could imagine this system that wasn't exactly what they had in mind. And it didn't go very well in 1796 either. But we see an even bigger failure in the next election, the election of 1800. Oh, I'm sorry, Kerry.
Just to add to the soap opera-ness of this, because it keeps going. So these two, what I lovingly refer to as historical frenemies, because they were constantly like in all of each other, but also in rivalry of each other, to the point where they died on the same day on 4th of July, 4 hours apart. And I always think one of them found out that the other one died and said, oh no, you're not dying on 4th of July. I'm dying on 4th of July. So just as we keep going, now to the next election, and the election of 1800s.
So this is, of course, an historic election. Jefferson would call it the Revolution of 1800. It's an important precedent where it's the first time, maybe in global history, but certainly in our history, where we see an incumbent president and incumbent party losing, and then the other party taking office peacefully. So it sets that really important precedent at the very beginning. Jefferson wins. It's not a huge victory in the Electoral College, but it's a little more decisive than Adams's was. It was 73 to 65. But the problem here is, as we all learned from the Hamilton musical, is that Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, they are supposed to be running mates here, but they receive the same number of electoral votes, 73 to 73. So again, under the original system, electors are voting for 2 people for president. And so all of the Democratic Republicans vote, 73 of them vote for Thomas Jefferson, 73 vote for Aaron Burr. Now, everyone as a practical matter knows Jefferson's at the top of the ticket. Aaron Burr is supposed to be the vice president, but Burr tries to game the system. He says, well, I tied. Let's see what happens. And so under the system, who's making the decision? It's 73-73. It goes to the House of Representatives. Who's in the House of Representatives? It's the Federalist House of Representatives that just lost the election. It's the lame duck Congress. And so these are Federalists who despise Thomas Jefferson. And so they have to make the decision. Is it Jefferson or is it Burr? They go through 6 days. They go through 36 ballots. You see the state militias, the governors, the Jeffersonian governors of Virginia, Pennsylvania saying, we're going to bring our militias together, and we're going to march on the Capitol. But in the end, Federalist leaders, including Alexander Hamilton, speak to their colleagues in the House of Representatives. Eventually, the Federalists determine that Thomas Jefferson, he's less of a threat than Aaron Burr. They support Jefferson. Jefferson then wins in the House of Representatives, wins the presidential election. But this isn't the ideal way in which you would want the system to work. And so, very quickly here, Kerry, we decide to revise the Constitution, to amend the Constitution, use that Article 5 amendment process to change the system. And so we get the 12th Amendment. And why did we get it so quickly? Well, the American people quite quickly said this election was a mess. This 1800 election was a mess. Let's not have another one like this. And so with the 12th Amendment, it's ratified in 7 months, which is really, really a quick ratification process. And it ironed out just some of the most glaring bugs in the original system. I mean, I think the important thing here, Kerry, is that the framers of the 12th Amendment are learning very early on there's going to be political parties. They're going to help organize this system. And so they create a system here where the electors are voting separately for president and vice president, with the thought that parties are going to put up national tickets, and the electors are probably going to vote for the national tickets corresponding, with the voters' preferences. And so with this, what this eliminates the possibility of is, that situation of Adams as president, Thomas Jefferson as vice president, and it limits the likelihood of there being a tie in the Electoral College, so a replay of the election of 1800. It's not impossible. You could still have candidates tying the Electoral College today, but it wouldn't be that sort of situation like what you saw in the election of 1800, where it's 2 people that are supposed to be running together. People think they're voting for Jefferson for president, and someone still tries to steal the election anyway.
Awesome. So, I want to dive into kind of the process of what's spelled out on a national level and what's spelled out on kind of what's left up to the states. So I am going to kind of make us go back to looking at probably Article 2 and dive into that. But do we want to take just a beat on faithless electors and kind of look at some of the current controversies around how that system can be chipped away at, like that the fact that we do have kind of this step-by-step process, and if people choose to not vote in the way that they are deemed to vote for, is that likely to happen? Has it ever happened in the past? And then what are the repercussions for that happening?
Yeah, so I mean, like within the system, I think even at the convention, what you would see is there are people like Hamilton who would have expected and wanted the electors to vote their independent judgment. So there were certainly prominent figures at the convention who had, and he wrote about it in Federalist 68, about the idea that the electors can be there to stand in and guard against the bad decisions of the people. So you certainly have that conception at the convention. I think, as we just said, Kerry, with the 12th Amendment, we see, certainly those framers embracing more a system that is going to be organized by political parties. And so even then you see a transformation of the conception of what the electors are really going to do. Over time, Kerry, you really don't see many faithless electors. You see really from the very beginning, the states already moving towards the popular vote within the states, and very, very, very few electors actually being faithless. In American history, there's been a total of 157 faithless electors. I have the numbers in front of me now, but most of them, a lot of them, 63 of them are from the election of 1872. Why were there so many faithless electors then? Well, the Democratic candidate Horace Greeley died between the election and the vote in the Electoral College. And so many voters, some of them still voted for him, some voted for other people, but you see a lot of faithless electors there. But as early as 1796, I love this story. You have an elector there, Samuel Miles, who he pledged, I'm going to vote for John Adams. This is what he tells the people, the people of his state. He selected, and then he decides to vote for Thomas Jefferson. And there's this great letter in the Pennsylvania Gazette from an angry voter who said, "What? Do I choose Samuel Miles to determine for me whether John Adams or Thomas Jefferson shall be president? No, I choose him to act, not to think." And so even very early on, Kerry, you see a norm of electors really supporting the popular vote in their respective states. And if we're looking, more broadly, Kerry, what does the Constitution tell us? What does the American constitutional tradition tell us? Well, beginning with the Constitution's text, we see that the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, again, as we said earlier, places a great deal of authority within the states to determine what sort of system they're going to have. And what we've seen from the Supreme Court over time, there was a case in 1892 called McPherson versus Blacker, to 1951, which was Ray versus Blair, to just last year, a case called Schiaffolo versus Washington. Each time, people bring challenges to what states decided to do. In the case of Schiaffolo, the case last term that's where our hypothetical comes from. There were states who decided, we're going to punish the faithless electors. The state of Washington, what do? They fine you $1,000 if you decide to vote against your pledge. Colorado just throws out your vote and puts someone else there in your place. And so the question before the Supreme Court in these two cases, the faithless elector cases last term, were, can the states do that? Is that consistent with the Electoral College's vision? Is that consistent with the system of federalism that the framers set up? And the answer for the Supreme Court, a unanimous Supreme Court said, yes, states can do that. And so with McPherson versus Blacker, 1892, Ray versus Blair, 1952, Schiaffolo versus Washington, 2020, we see the court over and over reaffirming that states have broad powers here. And so I think that's the one lesson we get from a combination of the Constitution's text, but also what the Supreme Court has said over time about the Electoral College.
Awesome. Okay, now I have a bunch of questions in the chat, so I'm going to stop the share. But everybody, please feel free to either put more questions in the chat or raise your hand. The way you can raise your hand, if you go to the bottom of the screen and click on reactions, you can put your hand up and we can, I'll call your name. You can ask the question directly. But Bibby's question in the chat, and it's really not a question, but I'm gonna make it into one because I love it. These checks and balances sure failed in the last election or with Trump. So I guess the two questions come of that right now is, where were, and we talk about this a lot at the Constitution Center, these guardrails. The founding fathers, put guardrails in. They expect people in our country to, when they vote, when they serve in office, to have values and to respect and uphold the democracy. But they also were worried about people not being like Washington and to put guardrails in there. And so what were the guardrails kind of in there and how much were they tested? And then I have a question about, and we'll just skip to the 25th Amendment, and a question about the impeachment process now after a president isn't a president anymore. Can they be impeached? Because I know that's going nuts right now and everybody's talking about it. So I just wanted to bring those two up really quickly, and then we'll turn it to the group for all the questions that you have for Tom.
No, those are obviously timely questions, Kerry, politically charged as well. I think that the answer on, the guardrails where were they? Well, I mean, I think that the things we have there set up within the Constitution are, one, the system of federalism. So what that had is that the state legislatures had set particular rules that were, followed state by state. And again, so you have that. You had Congress, passed the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which set up a process for if there are disputes. And so that's what you saw, on January 6th. That was that system set in place. That was Congress using its power to try to, fill in some of the details that weren't in the Constitution itself. But I think the key thing is that you have the Constitution's text, you have the state laws that were on the books that were put in place under the powers the states had under the Constitution. And then you had a court system that was set up to help adjudicate disputes under both the Constitution and those state laws. And so those guardrails being the Constitution's text, the state laws that were passed, and then the courts hearing challenges and deciding ultimately to dismiss them based on what was in the Constitution and based on what was in those state laws. I mean, I think the one thing I wouldn't say, the one thing to keep in mind is the flip side of our system of federalism is that states have a great deal of discretion between now and the next election day to decide how they want to, how they might want to alter their system in the Electoral College or select their electors. But again, they do that under risk of a voter reaction, et cetera. So, there's on the one hand, you have things in place. You have the guardrails. On the other hand, we still do trust a lot of those decisions to state legislatures and that political process.
And we're seeing that in Pennsylvania with House Bill 58, if I got the number correct, and what's going on right now with Act 77 and then House Bill 58. And it goes, and Tom, I know you will love this, so I will say it, it always goes back to we the people and what calls and actions we make to our representatives to represent us in the way that we want to see our state play in this system of electing a president. So great question from Autumn in the chat. If the Electoral College was abolished, what impact would it have on voting and representation?
Yeah, I mean, there are sort of there end up being arguments on both sides of this. So I
yeah,
mean,
and maybe that's a great way to do
yeah,
it. Like,
yeah. So I
lay
mean, like,
out, why would
again,
somebody want to keep it? Why would somebody
Yeah.
want to get rid of it? So that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, what does the Constitution leave for us? It leaves an amendment process in there because the founders believed they didn't have a monopoly on constitutional wisdom, but it makes it really, really, really hard to amend the Constitution. But yeah, you see the Electoral College comes up as a matter of constitutional debate many times in American history. I mean, I think it was during the Nixon administration. It came with it. Richard Nixon supported abolishing the Electoral College. It had bipartisan support. And it was just, a small number of small state senators in the Senate that blocked the amendment from going to the people for ratification. So it's not as though this is an issue that is necessarily partisan in any way, although I think parties typically react to, they want a system that they think is going to help their party versus another. But there's nothing inherent about it that's partisan in that sense throughout American history. The arguments against the Electoral College are the same ones that James Wilson made at the convention, which is that our system is supposed to be rooted in popular sovereignty. That means the person that gets the most votes should win. Pragmatically about, what's the criticism of how the Electoral College functions electorally? It's that, campaigns focus on the swing states and not on the rest of the states. And so that's the practical question that people who support reform would say. The defenders of the system would say, well, there is something to be said about relying on federalism within the presidential system. One, it allows for experimentation with how the vote's going to happen. So, someone like, a state like Maine can experiment with ranked order voting if another state doesn't want to do it. So there's some benefit there. The other is that in order to secure an Electoral College victory, you have to win a range of states throughout the country. And you get, and with that, you get a little bit of a bonus for certain states that are rural, that may not normally be heard and may be far from centers of power. Under a popular vote system, maybe they would be entirely ignored or not. I mean, those are sort of, I think the people who want to preserve the system value federalism, and the people who want to put a new system in place tend to value popular sovereignty. That's the very simple way I would say it.
And I love that idea that it's not like this way or that way, that there is kind of this ranging between that we're seeing with, voting by district or rank, and then adding in on top of that ranked choice voting. So I think there's lots of different factors here, but it is also hard to get your head wrapped around all of it. So this is like, think about this class as like your foundation. So next good question for Mary Ellen in the chat. Can the Senate in the impeachment trial not allow President Trump to ever run for office again? So let's back up to that question. So 25th Amendment, impeaching the president, impeachment of the president overall, not just what was in the 25th Amendment with the cabinet. But question for you. So they've never done this before. They've never they impeached President Trump a second time, and now they're having a trial, but he's not president. What's the likelihood of this going through? I was reading, I think it was Rand Paul freak out in the last couple of days about it. So kind of lay out what's going on around that. And then if the president is convicted, I think it would have to be convicted to be able to never be able to run for president again. So lay that all out for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the answer is we don't know. I mean, like really practically speaking, this has never happened before. There are arguments. So like I encourage everyone, our president and CEO, Jeffrey Rosen, has a podcast series, We the People, which is a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He just had advocates on each side of that particular argument on, Keith Whittington and Judge J. Michael Luttig, both of whom are typically thought of as conservatives, taking opposing positions as to whether or not a former president could be impeached. I think that the argument for people who say that the president could be the trial could still take place, he could be convicted, and it could be removed from office. In part, there is some historical precedent, not much, but some historical precedent of former office holders being tried and convicted, et cetera, that there is some, that not a president, but former office holders. The other is that the Constitution itself does have the punishment in there. You can't be convicted of a crime, so you can't be thrown in prison because of a Senate trial. But one of the penalties that is in the Constitution, you could be removed from office, and you could be barred from holding office in the future. And so for people who say that the president can be tried, convicted, and taken from office, they point to that. The other side, it's more of a question of, impeachment. Really, part of the text itself does talk about removal from office being one of the remedies there. The president is no longer in office, and so therefore there might be a mismatch between the text purpose and an impeachment trial, conviction, and removal. But again, I think the one thing I'd emphasize is it's never happened before. Certainly, people make constitutional respected voices make constitutional arguments on both sides, and we'll just sort of have to see how it plays out.
Talk about living in a moment of history. It's like nonstop anymore. Every day is like a big moment of history.
And furthermore, like the number of sort of like fairly obscure legal, laws or parts of the Constitution that we've had to learn about in recent years has been it's been a constitutional education for everyone, even people who study the Constitution.
So I am going to share it in the chat again right now. So we have this tool at the Constitution Center online. It's free. It's called the Interactive Constitution. And it's the top scholars on every single section, every single clause of the Constitution, kind of saying, this is what we agree upon, and here's where we diverge. And what we are fascinated by when moments happen like this in our country, you can literally watch that section of the Constitution light up on a board. You can see that all of a sudden, now everybody's Googling 25th Amendment Interactive Constitution. So feel free to dive into the whole Constitution and maybe take an easy one like Third Amendment that nobody ever talks about, quartering soldiers. So it's an easy one. Now, one more question for you, Tom, that I have in the chat. Oh, I actually might have a couple more for you. Mary Ellen back again about the Electoral College. Sorry, this is Autumn. Autumn asks, does the Electoral College weaken the votes of independent voters?
So weaken the votes of independent voters. I'd have to think about that. I think that the people who would most complain about the Electoral College are all people who live in big states, because the smaller states get a bit of a bonus because of the way the system's structured. I don't know if it would necessarily. I'd have to think about that. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I think maybe what I would, if I wanted to think about independent voters being weakened, and we can look at Pennsylvania, closed primaries is like my first instinct. That in closed primaries, if we're thinking that like so often it's a two-party system and it's just these two people, when it's a closed primary and an independent can't vote, then you have issues. So
and I would say like innovations like ranked choice voting provide at least independent candidates or non-major party candidates and those voters to have an additional way to express their clear support for something, for someone in a way that you simply can't with, or that people are much more reluctant to do without that.
So Melanie, just to let you know, I did put the podcast in the chat. It's right above the Interactive Constitution. I'll re-put it in there because it is a great one. But check out those podcasts. They're awesome. Next question, and I don't know if you will know this, Tom, and I don't actually have the answer for it either, but I'll just share it. Does anybody in the room, and maybe Shirley knows this, has PA ever moved towards becoming an electorally split state? I feel like it might be easier for PA to do that than to do a national popular vote, but that's just my like guess on how PA would come out. Tom, do you know? How do you know about? Yeah,
I don't, but there's been enough variety through American history that it wouldn't surprise me if that I'm sure there must have been major initiatives at various times, maybe even in earlier times it may have been distributed differently, because plenty of other states who now have winner take all had those systems of split vote in previous times.
Yeah, so it's amazing how we come back and forth to ideas and kind of the ebb and flow of it.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll emphasize that really is amazing, and it's just, again, to give credit to James Wilson, is that, if we're thinking about the history of the implementation of the Electoral College, we have federalism, but it really struck me when I first studied this, how quickly we moved towards the popular vote selecting electors in each state. that is like it's the earliest theme in a lot of this, because it really was a choice for the states. Do you want the state legislature to do it, or do you want the voters to have a say in choosing electors? And we really did select the popular vote within the states to select electors. And so in that sense, that sort of democratic push began really at the very beginning, and it never stopped.
Fascinating. So maybe inevitable as
Wilson thought
Marvel.
so. I don't know.
Wilson?
It certainly, I would imagine it must have surprised, many members of the founding generation that it moved as quickly as it did. Because it was by 1828, the only state that was not selecting through popular vote was South Carolina. So even by then, it was very quick.
Awesome. I think at this point in time, we are out of questions unless anybody would like to open their mic, turn it on and give an open mic question. I'll give you a minute to do that. I know, I love that. I feel like I'm at a bar. Who wants an open mic moment? And yes, that will be on the recording. Okay, great. Tom, thank you so much. This was a great conversation and discussion on the Electoral College, on ranked choice voting. We all appreciate you very much. I can see the claps going on there. And is there anything, as we think about many of our members on this call are people in Pennsylvania, which is a very diverse state of opinions, of ideas, and of opportunities. We are a very creative state. I like to say, we in Pennsylvania with Philadelphia, we kind of invented this whole democracy thing for the rest of the country. Take a little cred for the state. But anything you would want us to walk away with to think of when we're thinking and talking about the Electoral College?
I think it's just that federalism is really important within the system, and that states really do, like the founding generation valued experimentation in the states along a lot of different dimensions. And of course, we know that's a key part of the 19th Amendment story, but many other amendments. But certainly when it comes to the electoral systems in various states, that the state voters, the state legislatures really have power to shape how electors will be selected. And although we've all combined around 48 of the states have combined around winner take all, there's nothing inevitable about that.
Awesome. Very cool. Thank you all very much. I want to turn it back to Shirley, who is going to kind of wrap us all up. And so let me do the pinning.
Okay.
All you.
And I can speak now. Okay, people can hear me now. We owe a great deal of thanks to both Kerry and Tom for taking us through the Electoral College, and hopefully you're going away with something you didn't know, or you better understand this Electoral College thing. And you can grasp how difficult it was for the founding fathers to figure this whole thing out. What is the best way? Because in my personal opinion, I don't know that there is a best way, because there's always going to be difficulties and issues with however you decide to do it. But again, thank you so much for being part of it. And I hope, and I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And I hope you felt that it was a very worthwhile use of your time. We will be, I need to put a plug in 2 weeks, February 9th, we will be doing another Zoom session. And this one will be on potentially 4 amendments to the Pennsylvania Constitution that are being considered by the legislature. We will have with us Gene Handley, who is very active in Central Pennsylvania's Fair Districts group, speaking particularly about one that would create districts for electing judges. And that is obviously, being part of Fair Districts, something that she, as well as the League of Women Voters, are particularly concerned. She will also be talking about legislative rules and about gerrymandering in general, and we'll also touch on the other 3 amendments. It's February 9th, 7 o'clock. You go to our website, lwvhbg.org, under upcoming events, and you can, as you did for this one, register for that event, and you will then be emailed the connection. Remember, this was recorded, and in a few days it will be on our website, so that you can view it or share it with other people, or see some of the documents that were used, if you want to refer to them again. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good evening and rest of the week. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you, Shirley. I think I'm going to just turn it over to Mary Ellen had a question real quick. I see your hand
Oh,
raised,
okay.
Mary Ellen,
Yes.
real quick. Just unmute yourself first.
Sorry. I wanted to ask Kerry and Tom if they support abolishing the Electoral College.
I'll give the speech. So we work at the National Constitution Center where we talk all about the Constitution and we bring up all perspectives around it. So we no longer have opinions on these things.
We're not,
We literally want to educate all sides. And I have to be honest and transparent about that is I wind up second guessing every time I think I have a thought, like, oh, I think it's this. And then I hear a perspective from the other side that is very valid. And so what we really try to do as an institution is pull together all the information and realize, you know, like Shirley said, nothing's going to be perfect. And what is the best move and right choices for our country at this time? Tom, I'll let you add to that.
I don't have anything else to add. No, that's absolutely right. We hand over our policy card when we get to the National Constitution Center and just try to, provide the best arguments on all sides. And again, I just want to make the plug. Kerry already did, but for the interactive Constitution, where it is for each clause of the Constitution, we had Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society nominate a scholar who had to write essays on what they agreed about that provision and what they disagreed about. And so we have a series of essays on the Electoral College, which are very good, from Jim Caesar of UVA and Jamie Raskin of the University of Maryland, now a member of Congress as well.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Kerry, there's another question in the chat room that just came up, I think.
So Ray, hi Ray. So in the process of Congress ratifying the Electoral College vote, has there ever been any legitimate objections made at this supposedly ceremonious event? Lovely question, Ray. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I mean, there have been scattered objections. So I think I remember in 2004, I think it was Senator Boxer objected to the results in Ohio of the presidential election. So there have been some examples in the past, and of course the classic example of we talked about the election of 1800. The election of 1876 is the other big historical example where Congress frankly just couldn't even come to a conclusion by itself like it normally would as to how that election should be decided. And so they had to create a special commission to try to figure out how to settle it. But yeah, no, there have been some objections, though I haven't done a full I haven't done a full assessment of exactly how many, or I certainly don't know all of them. I just know that one off just having read, like everyone else.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. It was great to have you at this program. Shirley, thank you so much for having us.
Thank
And
you, Kerry.
without that, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you so
Good night.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Good. Really good.